So, hey, Steve. Uh,
Nice to see you.
Welcome everyone to our actual first webinar on uh, Spectrum. We're joined by Phil Steinhauer-Mozejko, who is with the ICI, the Indigenous Connectivity Institute, as well as Steve Song, who is with the Internet Society, both experts in their fields, and there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom around spectrum in this Zoom room. So, Phil, I'll turn it right over to you to get started.
Thanks, Mark. I wasn't expecting you to have to say some preparatory remarks, but thank you. So thanks for joining today, everyone. I see we got some good numbers here attending, and Steve and I are gonna see if I can get in focus here. Steve and I are gonna do a little overview of the Explainer series, the Spectrum Explainer series that we published earlier this year. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of the Explainer, I should mention that while the series is co-authored, uh, I must say that the lion's share, the brunt of the work and the writing was done by the Spectrum guru himself, Steve Song. So, who we're really lucky to have collaborated and worked with, who has helped us with this. So, credit goes to Steve, but it was a collective effort, and we're really pleased with how it turned out. So, with no further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do presenter. Okay. So hi, everyone. We're going to start with some introductions. As Mark said who I am, I'm Phil Steinhauer-Mozejko. I work for the Indigenous Connectivity Institute. I'm Director of Indigenous and External Relations. I'm not a technical expert or someone who has a background in spectrum, but I have developed a good competency and literacy and understanding in spectrum policy. And first and foremost, I come from an Indigenous rights perspective. I'm based in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary or Mohkinstsis, where the Bow meets the Elbow River. And I'm a member of Onitshiksquapoan or Saddle Lake Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 6 territory. It's about 200 kilometers northeast of Edmonton. Steve, pass it to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name's Steve Song. I'm a senior director at the Internet Society, and a lot of my work for the last 10 years has been on looking at what are the obstacles to community ownership of access infrastructure, and looking at everything from backhaul networks to funding, but in particular, looking at spectrum and what are the barriers to accessing radio spectrum and why? Why is it important? And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Hi, hi. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so some of the goals of this webinar today is we're going to link each of the three parts together. Steve and I, mainly Steve, will expand on some of the key or core concepts. We're going to talk about why spectrum matters, specifically for Indigenous, tribal, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities in Turtle Island and Inuit Nunangat. And we kind of seek to narrativize and engage in story with spectrum to kind of build interest and awareness and literacy because stories resonate and it's who we are. We are stories. And we need to make the subject matter kind of engaging. And so that's what we seek to do is kind of narrativize it. Why did we make the Spectrum Explainer series? Steve, the impetus for it. What say you?
Well, there's a saying about why you should study economics, and that's so you can't be fooled by economists. And I think the same thing kind of applies to spectrum regulation and management. Is that often you hear things, spectrum is scarce, spectrum is unavailable, spectrum has to be auctioned. Um, and it's very difficult to push back against those or even have a conversation about them if you don't have the foundations to understand to talk about where things could happen, could change, or could be.
And in terms of target audience, we did develop this with tribal leadership in mind, decision makers, as well as network operators to kind of put things in lay terms, provide some accessible language for some of the jargon of spectrum, so to speak. And we want to provide it for non-technical people who are kind of building skills and literacy in the Indigenous connectivity space. And in terms of desired outcomes, it's really to present a clear overview of what spectrum is, how it works, and why it's important, critically so for Indigenous communities across the continent, particularly for Indigenous ISPs and service providers and wireless ISPs, community networks, and we seek to kind of demystify spectrum. So a little bit of preamble before we get into the meat of the presentation here. So the ICI has taken a pretty, I would say, heavily engaged, a lot of businesses tied up in spectrum advocacy and spectrum rights. So we mentioned that the ICI positions spectrum access and shared use from an inherent right and relationship-based perspective. That means we're thinking about treaty rights, we're thinking about inherent rights, and in the United States, we're thinking of the trust relationship between federally recognized tribes and the federal government. And we're also thinking of spectrum from a sovereignty and self-determination perspective. And kind of key to sustainability in these areas is affordable access to wireless spectrum for tribal and Indigenous communities. So I do want to situate the presentation kind of or foreground it by UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is it's a non-binding resolution, but it's kind of Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and other countries of the global north have signed on. And so some preamble in UNDRIP that kind of positions our approach to Indigenous spectrum access, recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, social structures, and from their cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. And in Canada, 2 years ago, in 2023, the federal government passed Bill C-15, an act respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so a summary from that is that the enactment provides the GOC must take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Articles of UNDRIP. And the government must prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the declaration. And this is applicable to all federal ministries and departments, including ISED or ISED and the CRTC, those bodies that kind of manage and oversee aspects of telecommunications, spectrum, and innovation therein. And so in Canada, a key piece of that Broadcasting Act legislation, which was kindly brought to us from our colleague, Gregory Taylor from University of Calgary, the Canadian broadcasting system operating primarily in English and the French languages, comprising public, private, and community elements, makes use of radio frequencies that are public-private property and provides, through its programming, a public service essential to the maintenance and enhancement of national identity and cultural sovereignty. And I bold that cultural sovereignty piece because I think that's interesting wording that was included. In the United States, commensurately, there's the Communications Act, which is from approximately 1932, Title 47, purpose of the chapter, among other things, to maintain the control of the U.S. over all the channels of radio transmission and to provide for the use of such channels, but not the ownership thereof by persons for limited periods of time under licenses granted by federal authority. and ICI Advisory Committee member and friend and colleague and remarkable human, Madeline Redfern, on the record. Spectrum is a resource and we need to have access. And those words are true. And from Greg Taylor, no one owns the spectrum. And that is also true. And we'll get into shared use and access. Additionally, the ICI has developed a mission statement over the past year, and that is that the ICI strengthens Indigenous digital equity by supporting communities to build skills, shape policy, and grow the networks that connect us physically, digitally, and culturally. Our vision is for Indigenous communities across Turtle Island and Inuit Nunangat to have full control over our digital futures, building, owning, and governing the networks, knowledge, and technologies that sustain our ways of life, culture, and our self-determination. So we're going to get in part one of RF Spectrum Basics. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Steve, to tell us what is spectrum and why the hell does it matter?
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, and this is maybe the hardest question of all, is what is radio spectrum? Because we talk about it as if it were property. In fact, we even almost assign property rights to spectrum. But is it a thing like land or something like that that you could touch? It isn't. It really, at its essence, is a vibration, right? Vibrations in electromagnetic radiation. And you can understand it by looking at vibrations in other media. So right now I'm speaking to you and vibrate through vibrations in sound and encoding meaning in vibrations in sound, which is very analogous with the data that we encode in radio spectrum, or even by dropping a pebble into a pond, we create waves and these vibrations. And even there, you could encode messages in that in those waves in that pond by varying how you drop those stones into the pond. And these metaphors, I think, are extremely helpful in terms of understanding radio spectrum because it makes them kind of more visible and more tractable. Next slide, please. So there are all different kinds of waves that range in frequency. So that is the space in between the peaks of the waves can be closer together or further apart. And the reason why that's important is because it affects the quality of communication in when you're using it for to communicate. So longer waves, which have greater distances between their peaks, are lower down in the frequency spectrum, and they have the quality of being able to pass through things more easily than higher frequency waves. And so this is important when you think about building an access network. The lower the frequency, the better the propagation, the better the coverage you're going to get. So with lower frequencies, you might only have to put up one tower, whereas with higher frequencies, you might have to put out several, which increases your capital costs. But there's a trade-off. As you go down in the frequencies, you lose the capacity to pack information into those radio waves. So higher frequencies have the virtue of being able to carry a great deal more data. And so in any decision about deploying a radio network, you have to balance these trade-offs of what is going to give you better coverage versus what is going to give you enough throughput to deliver the communication that you want to deliver. Next slide, please. So indeed, pursuing this analogy of ripples in a pond as a metaphor for radio communication. If there's just one person dropping stones in that pond, it's very easy to see those ripples. But when you get to multiple people dropping stones in the pond, the waves you make don't disappear, but they become much harder to recognize, much harder to see. And so your communication deteriorates. And this, I think, it comes to the fundamental reason why we have an ISED or, in general, a spectrum regulator is to manage this. Next slide, or next two slides, please. So the goal, the purpose of agencies like ISED in dealing with spectrum is to manage this issue of interference, to make sure that one user of the spectrum can use the spectrum in an effective way without causing interference, without impeding the use of anybody else in that spectrum. And that seems like a simple thing, but as we'll see, it gets quite complex. Next slide, please.
Now, Steve, are you going to
Oh,
mention the ITU?
absolutely. And
Okay,
I think maybe we'll hold that just for a little bit later
sure.
in the presentation. But definitely, that is the kind of prime agency globally in terms of trying to work out how to manage spectrum. So with any communication, every time there's a radio communication, you have four factors that affect the success of that communication. The sender, the recipient, the medium through which it travels, and other radio transmissions. And I'm going to try and explain that with another metaphor because I really love metaphors. Um, so next slide, please. Imagine you're in a conference room, right? And you're standing at one side of the conference room and you want to communicate with someone at the other side of that conference room. Well, you can just speak to them. And if they can't hear you, you speak with more energy, you speak louder. And so that is the one, probably most significant factor is the transmitter in radio communication and how loud you're allowed to speak is a huge factor in the success of that communication. Um, Next slide, please. The second piece then is the receiver of that communication. And can we have oh, there we are. Yeah. So it's that
Sorry,
other
a little
person.
lag there, Steve.
Yeah, no, it's no problem. It's that other person at the other side of the room, and the quality of their reception is almost as big a factor as the transmitter themselves. So, for instance, if you had an older person and a young person on the other side of the room, perhaps the young person might be able to hear what you're saying, but the old person with their deteriorating hearing can't. And so the quality of the receiver is as important a factor in in radio communication as the transmitter, and the two have to go together. Now, if that room is filled with people talking with each other, then that same voice that you used to communicate to the other side of the room is not going to be heard by them because it's not because you're speaking any softer and it's not because your voice goes away, but there are too many other people speaking that make it impossible to make out what the transmitter is saying. And this is what is known as radio interference, right? So the ability to pick up from the transmitter to the receiver is affected when there are other transmitters in the area. And this is absolutely key to understanding spectrum management. And then there's the fourth piece, which is the medium through which you transmit. So if you can picture, someone puts up a divider in the middle of the room, then that same voice that you use to communicate on the other side of the room is unlikely to be heard because it has trouble going through that divider. In the real world, what does this look like? It looks like buildings and trees and rain and snow. All of those things can impede radio communication. So once you've understood those four things, you understand everything you need to know about radio communication. If you can manage those four factors, you can have successful communication and successful, broadband networks or radio or voice networks or whatever you like. But let's focus for now on those other transmitters and how you manage that. Um, and so how who gets access to that spectrum, and how do you get access to that spectrum? And that begins with deciding what frequencies can be used for what purposes, because generally you want the same technologies to use a particular frequency. Otherwise, controlling interference becomes very, very challenging. And that's tricky because we live in a globalized environment, and manufacturers like to manufacture equipment that works in a certain way. And so we coordinate. And the way that coordination happens, it goes through a UN body called the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, and that is a treaty body that almost all countries are signatory to, in which these things are negotiated. They've negotiated which frequencies can be used for what purposes. So, for instance, 5G or 4G technologies, the decisions about what frequencies can be used for those technologies is decided in a negotiated environment at the ITU. And as a treaty organization, these countries who are signatories to these treaties are bound to respect the decisions. Having said that, every country has sovereignty over their own radio spectrum, and sovereignty is a word you don't often see in technology. Well, I guess increasingly more nowadays, but it's a word that uh, isn't something that technologists think about a lot, but but it's a reality that there is this balance between the international organizations and sovereign nations, and so sovereign nations make decisions that may vary from the ITU decisions because they have the right to do that. But what we often do, what isn't taken into account is other sovereign nations within those nations and the say that they should have in the allocation of spectrum. And this is also an important point here. Next slide. Is that this is called the allocation of spectrum. And so it's deciding.
Steve,
Yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to chime in, and for anyone who was unaware, no sovereign indigenous nation is attends the ITU or has a seat in those kind of coordinating discussions at the international level. And so part of what the ICI and other organizations seek to do and are doing is to try to apply some pressure to federal government so that Indigenous nations and communities within, for instance, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, or wherever First Peoples live and are, that we are at the very least not just considered, but on a delegation with a federal government, and potentially even moving beyond the permanent forum on Indigenous peoples at the United Nations to actually have a seat at the table, so that we are there with the decision makers who kind of coordinate around spectrum usage and the development of devices for interoperability. So I just wanted to make that key point, is that is a big advocacy piece to spectrum. Please carry on, Steve.
I think it's a really important one in terms of being a participant in the dialogue is absolutely key to getting better outcomes, and making sure that Indigenous communities are represented in these dialogues is fundamental to having better outcomes. And I should say, if there are comments or questions from the audience, please don't hesitate to post a comment in the chat.
Yes, please. And we do have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, just for your information.
Right. So back to allocation. So allocation, this process that happens, largely at the ITU, but also nationally, is deciding what different frequencies can be used for. But that and you can often find that information on virtually every regulator's website. They've got one of those kind of those charts with all the little boxes on it, and almost every country has one. What you see less of is the next stage, which is the assignment of those spectrum, the issuing of licenses, and finding out who has licenses for what spectrum is much harder than it should be, in my experience. And many countries don't do a very good job of demonstrating who has licenses for what frequencies in what place. And given that these licenses are often auctioned for millions and millions of dollars, the lack of transparency in that space is absolutely key. Sorry, can we back up one there just a little bit? Thanks. And then the last thing is, you may issue a license, but if the operator doesn't put up towers, then you still get no outcome, right? So the actual use of the spectrum is the last piece and absolutely key. Allocation, assignment, and use are fundamental to kind of understanding the utility of spectrum. Now, before we leave assignment, how do you get access to that spectrum? Well, as demand for spectrum has increased, and especially for a spectrum that it relates to mobile broadband, 3G, 4G, 5G technologies, as the demand has exceeded the availability of that spectrum, regulators have had to decide, well, how should we do this fairly? How should we make it available in a fair way? And starting in the early 1990s, but now by far the dominant model for doing that is through an auction. And the theory behind the auction process is that by auctioning the spectrum, the person who values it the most will win and gain the spectrum, and they will have the biggest incentive to roll out infrastructure, having paid for the spectrum, but also and having demonstrated that they value it through through their bids for the spectrum. And there is a certain logic to that, because assigning spectrum that doesn't get used is extremely counterproductive and difficult to undo. So you can see the logic, but there are two critical downsides to the auctioning of spectrum. One is that they often drive up the price of the network rollout. So if there are millions of dollars spent on the license, then that money has to come back from somewhere, and it comes back from the subscriber. Because these licenses are national in scope largely, they can be used to exclude the competition, right? So that you can sometimes you'll get operators bidding for spectrum, if only to exclude others from getting access to it. But most of all, I think for small operators, the fact that this spectrum is going for millions of dollars means they can't get a look in. So this is particularly bad for small operators to be able to gain access to spectrum. Now, for small operators, oh yeah, no, that's great. The next slide. For small operators, there is a way around that, and that's through the use of unlicensed spectrum. So there is back in the early days of allocating spectrum, people decided that, well, we need to make some space for scientists and for engineers and for test and measurement. So they carved out some frequencies that said, okay, well, you can use this spectrum, but only on certain terms. And those frequencies, which are known as the industrial, scientific, and measurement bands, now more popularly known as unlicensed or license exempt spectrum, have been a huge engine of innovation. And now what we know is Wi-Fi and Bluetooth operates in those frequencies. And how is that possible? Because, to prevent interference, typically we've had to have a license to exclude others from that spectrum. Well, the way it's done is by encoding the rules, the license, into the technology itself. So for Wi-Fi devices, there are two things that make it possible for Wi-Fi devices to work together. One is they're very limited in power output, so they can only speak quietly. And so you can have lots of Wi-Fi devices because they speak quietly, not like a big mobile tower that broadcasts over kilometers. They may speak 50 to 100 meters. And the second thing is they're incredibly polite. So they have a technology embedded in them called listen before talk that waits to see if nobody else is speaking, and then uses the spectrum when it's its turn. So it's been a hugely successful technology, especially for small ISPs building out Wi-Fi infrastructure, but it has one particular downside, and that is its low power. So if you want to build out a network with Wi-Fi, you need a lot of devices, right? Which increases the complexity of the network and limits you in some ways in terms of where access is. And it doesn't scale very well for large Wi-Fi networks. And would be much better if you could put up an LTE or 5G base station that, because it has the higher power output, can broadcast to an entire community and bring an entire community online with one tower or maybe two towers. And so that's very desirable. But until recently, unless you had millions of dollars, you couldn't gain access to that technology. But that's changing, and a lot has changed, I'd say, in the last 10 years. And what we see now is the developing of licensing of LTE and 5G spectrum. We can go to the next slide, in ways that are very, very innovative and can unlock access for community-based operators and indigenous operators. So the first one, and it's a pretty sensible idea and very straightforward, is like, well, let's make smaller licenses, right? Let's not issue licenses for the entire country, but let's do it on a kind of community by community basis, and let's not auction them, because there's not going to be a dozen operators in every community. There's probably only going to be one or two. We can do it in a non-competitive way and issue local licenses. And that's something that Canada has been developing in the 3.9 gigahertz, I think that's the right frequency band, to be able to enable access. Now, coming back to our spectrum chart, 3.9 gigahertz is excellent for broadband. It's relatively high up in the frequency band, and it's very, very good for delivering for high broadband 5G style applications. So this is a tremendous step forward. The second way is to say, well, if there are operators who have licenses but aren't building out, if you remember the allocation, assignment of and use, if they're not using the spectrum, well, maybe we should make that available to local operators who want to build out infrastructure. And so this is known as a kind of use it or share it approach to spectrum. And it's a kind of fundamental shift in the way we talk about licenses. So typically licenses for spectrum have meant a right to exclusivity of use. But this approach says, well, actually, we're going to change your license to mean that it gives you a right to protection from interference. So for the person who has the primary license, wherever they've built out infrastructure, they are protected. They have the right to protection from interference. But where they have no plans to build out infrastructure, they have fewer rights. And so the regulator can then begin sharing that spectrum on a secondary basis. And this use it or share it in Canada, it's known as the access licensing framework. In the UK, I think it's called confusingly, the local access license framework. And this relates to the Indigenous priority window, because it's this spectrum that is the priority window has been linked to. There are other ways of approaching this. Strategic purpose licenses. So almost 15 years ago now, in Mexico, the regulator set aside, there's a very small amount of spectrum. It was less than 10 megahertz of 900 megahertz spectrum, but they set aside spectrum for indigenous communities, and that allowed nonprofit indigenous operators such as Rhizomatica and TIC to build out cellular networks in the state of Oaxaca, and for almost no license fee. It was very successful in that regard. A much more ambitious and bigger win after 20 years of lobbying by the Maori in New Zealand was 100 megahertz of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, which was awarded to the Maori, who have been able to use this as a strategic asset in leasing it back to incumbent operators, in being able to use the spectrum themselves within specific contexts, and it's turned the Maori into a player within the telecoms marketplace in New Zealand. It has been a complete game changer for them, and the revenues that they have derived from leasing that spectrum back to the operators is funding the capacity building that they're doing to build a technical capacity among the Maori to build out more infrastructure.
And they're reinvesting it in other areas of their community, their economic, social, cultural aspects of their nation as well. It's
It is an
remarkable.
amazing story. And I think those are the big ones. There are also, I mean, dynamic spectrum sharing is similar to use it or share it spectrum, but it's driven by a geolocation database. So it's implementing that use it or share it framework and local licensing, but driven by a database that says, oh, spectrum's free here, spectrum's not free here, and assigns the spectrum dynamically. You may have heard of TV white space regulation, which has been a kind of mixed bag in terms of success in the US and Canada and other countries. A bigger success has been more recently Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, in the US, which has implemented that very, very successfully. To my knowledge, the only country in the world that has managed to do that. And then last but not least is the notion of a mobile virtual network operator. So there you don't build your own infrastructure, you use somebody else's infrastructure and build a kind of network on top of that. And the biggest success story that I know of in that regard is a cooperative in Mexico called Wikicatat. And because Mexico has a national wholesale wireless network called the Red Compartida, they have been able to build their MVNO on top of that. And because as a cooperative, they've been able to offer substantially lower prices than commercial operators. The downside of an MVNO is that you can only build it where there is existing infrastructure. You can't go into green fields. So there are other kinds of sharing, typically that happens between large operators, but for small operators, this is, I think, the key ways in which access to spectrum can happen. And that's really it for the kind of intro to spectrum. It would be lovely to hear questions and comments and feedback.
And as we kind of segue into the conclusion of the presentation, thank you so much, Steve, for that.
Oh,
That's
sorry.
brilliant.
Yes. I mean,
I did want to
preclude the last section. My apologies.
No worries. No, we do want to give a little overview of the current so-called state of Indigenous or tribal spectrum rights in Canada and the United States. So I'm not sure if our colleague Sharia Lane is on the line, or anyone in the United States for that matter, who has some insights into the potential for Tribal Priority Window 2. There were some murmurs or perhaps some advocacy around another window, another opportunity presenting itself at some point. I am unaware as to the status of that. However, on the Canadian side, it should be noted that the Indigenous Priority Window, or the IPW, has kind of come to a bit of a standstill. And I do want to make note that the ICI, through our calls to action, really has a specific section carved out related to Indigenous spectrum access. And so if you get an opportunity, please go to our website and review those calls to action. And specifically, you can see how we call on governments to recognize Indigenous rights to spectrum. Some call it spectrum sovereignty. And so I do want to mention again, with respect to that IPW, if we're talking about awareness or understanding in this area of spectrum, which is a very important and lucrative aspect of society for the Canadian government and for the federal government through licensing and those spectrum auctions. There were less than 20 comments submitted on the record to the initial consultation period for the IPW. And that's factoring in over 600 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada. So that kind of tells you about the level of awareness around spectrum. And some of those themes and highlights by Indigenous service providers and operators who put comments on the record. So several commenters criticized that the scope of the IPW was too narrow and argue that offering priority access only to specific leftover bands, they call it leftover bands, 800 megahertz or 1900 megahertz, does not constitute true sovereignty over the resource. They call for broader recognition of Indigenous ownership or shared usage of spectrum as a natural resource that's consistent with UNDRIP. And so we repeatedly come back to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities positioning or foregrounding UNDRIP in many of the arguments as a key document. Many other comments just wanted to let the government know that we do consider spectrum a natural resource and that we have to be aware that when some of these spectrum licenses, that some of these potential spectrum licenses can be considered useless without adequate backhaul and funding for infrastructure. So I know that Sitchun, our colleagues in Sitchun in northern Quebec, mentioned on the record that it was important to pair spectrum releases with funding mechanisms or subordinate licensing rules that would force incumbents, big telcos, to share their fiber backhaul at reasonable rates. So those are just some of the things that we heard and that the government heard around spectrum access in Canada specifically. And we're happy to share presentation slides with everyone who attended today. There are some documents and further reading that we recommend everyone look into. I do want to give a shout out to Steve Song's Internet is U-Shaped article or blog that was published maybe a few years ago, Steve, but which I think is as relevant as ever today. As a small kind of anecdote related to that, when I'm visiting family in Saddle Lake, it's all wireless networks that are affording their connectivity there. And I've noticed that the households that do have access to wireless broadband are doing more interesting and productive things. And they're able to have a level of control and freedom that moves beyond just kind of critical communication that allows them to engage politically, socially, and economically with the rest of the world. And so I think the internet is U-shaped, Steve. I just think the world of that article, and my friend Spencer Sevilla was the one who first put me on it. And I recommend everyone read The Internet is U-Shaped. The other is the policy brief by your organization, Internet Society, which was recently published. I encourage everyone to please go over to ISOC and read that policy brief on spectrum. Hi, Exe. That's the end of the presentation. So we welcome any comments or questions that folks may have. And if we have any of our friends and our relatives from Indian country in the United States, we welcome your input onto the state of spectrum down south. Mark, can you read any of the comments or questions there?
Yeah, and there are several.
Oh, I see. Wow, there are
Are
a lot.
there
Okay.
are there Indigenous nations who lease their spectrum? Troy's asking.
Are there Indigenous nations who lease their spectrum? So is that like the Maori potentially? Or is it like subleasing spectrum? Steve, do you have an answer?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Whether are they do you mean who have spectrum rights and are then reselling or leasing that spectrum to other operators?
I would assume yes, it's something to that. Are there Indigenous nations who lease their spectrum? We can answer it in that way. Yeah.
To my knowledge, it's only the Maori who have been successful in doing that, but I stand under correction whether there may be other examples.
Selling it back. I have personally not heard of this with any Indigenous providers in Canada, community networks in Canada. There's a few, a robust few who operate across the country. And to this point, I haven't heard of any Indigenous ISPs leasing or selling their spectrum.
I think the comment, one of the comments submitted about the Indigenous priority window regarding the 1900 megahertz spectrum or PCS spectrum really illustrates the point that it is essential to really understand the technology and the radio spectrum to know its potential. So PCS spectrum is kind of older spectrum in terms of the what it was originally used for to build voice networks, but there is actually 5G frequencies within the PCS spectrum, so you could build a 5G network with that spectrum. And so knowing what the allocation has been for spectrum and what its potential is, because 1900 megahertz is, or sorry, yeah, 1900 megahertz is great for building access networks. So if you wanted to cover an entire community, it is very good for that because it's low enough in the frequency band that you can get really pretty good coverage. Whereas the non-competitive local licensing in 3.9 gigahertz has a lot more throughput, but is much more limited in propagation. So it might be good for point-to-point networks or for very small dense networks. And so and that pushback about, well, why only these frequencies, I think is absolutely correct in that there should be an entire toolbox of frequencies made available under these licensing frameworks. And this is exactly what the UK regulator have done, is they've created the license framework and they've put a bunch of frequencies in it. And then they've begun to say, well, we reserve the right to add more frequencies under this framework to make them accessible. And I think that's exactly what every country should do, is once you create the idea of how the spectrum can be shared, then you should be able to add as much as possible to it.
Francis was asking a question, and I don't know, Mark, do we know whether guests in the room are able to speak?
I do not believe so. You can only type your questions.
Ay, ay, ay.
No spectrum for you.
Yeah, it's one of the downfalls of Zoom.
Francis, I don't know if you're here or you heard that. It doesn't look like we're able to unlock or grant you mic access. I'm sorry about that. But if you want to put something in the chat, we can save your comment. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yes, Deanna. Oh, it's nice to see you in here. I'm glad you attended. We will be sharing all our links and we will be providing slides as requested. And the session is being recorded. If we promote panelists to be, Francis to be a panelist, she can speak. Okay. Can we add a panelist?
I just did. I just promoted them to panelists. So, Francis, you should be able to speak.
Yes. You're muted, Francis.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Phil. Thank you. So I wanted to just share some information. I know with that tribal priority licensing window, we did provide some open comments and we did get a response indicating that, and this is for the AWS 3 band. And so FCC came back and did say that it would not be in the public's interest to implement a new tribal licensing window and that it would delay. So therefore, the tribal priority window was kind of closed at that time, but it would open up hopefully in the future. So we're looking for future input on allowing tribal nations to have another tribal priority window.
Thank you. And I heard there was a little bit of discussion in the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Working Group about that yesterday, and Shreya spoke to it a little bit. So thank you for sharing that.
No problem. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you, Francis. By the way, we have a question in the Q&A from Dana Beltran saying, "Hi, Phil and Steve. Thanks so much for the presentation." They operate their community network coordinator at Colnoro in Colombia. They've been doing advocacy work to push for regulations that would enable the use of 900 megahertz band for rural and indigenous communities there. I'd like to ask you, what recommendations do you have for communities or civil society organizations to achieve direct impact in these regulatory processes?
I'm happy to tackle that one. And I feel a bit remiss in that in not mentioning Colnado, in that they have been a pioneer in deploying low-cost LTE for community networks in Colombia, partly supported by the Internet Society. So I think it is way overdue for spectrum advocates within Indigenous communities to make common cause. Right? There's not, from my point of view, there could be a lot more knowledge sharing, and a louder voice as a result by having a global community of Indigenous spectrum advocates, because the experience of different countries can be used as leverage. For instance, I think before seeing what happened with the Maori in New Zealand, one might not have been so ambitious, right? One might have said, well, maybe we're lucky to have an Indigenous priority window. And then to see that the Maori now have assigned rights to 100 megahertz of 5G spectrum, that kind of changes the game. But I think there's much more that could be shared, and a common narrative, and resources. This is, I think, could happen. It should happen as soon as possible.
So there's a.
In terms,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what recommendations do you have for communities and civil society organizations? I think it's stick-to-itiveness, to give you a cliche, Dana, and relationship building. In our own work at the ICI, you have to strike a balance, I believe, in terms of holding to account and fighting for your community and understanding your inherent right as an Indigenous person within your nation and your community. But then it is a relational aspect and approach. We have to work in good faith with these larger governments and bodies, and so stick-to-itiveness and patience and pardon me if this sounds kind of, you can roll your eyes, but I wouldn't, but really approaching with kindness. And that doesn't necessarily mean being passover or acquiescing. No, there can be forthright kindness, but I think it is an important thing in respectful and good relations with people that we have to work with, non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples together as allies and humans living and working together on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunangat. So I really strongly believe in that relationship building and the relational approach and stick-to-itiveness, because we are seeing progress over time and our messages are getting through and trickling through to the levers of power. So that's what I can say on that.
Phil, there's another two-parter question. What is the type of access used by most Indigenous networks in Canada? And also, if you can explain a bit about the process of a community should normally goes through to build their own network. So the first one, what is the type of access used by most Indigenous networks in Canada?
Great question, Steve. Can you, any inkling on that?
I feel like there are others that are going to be better informed on this than I am. I think everyone uses Wi-Fi, and because it's available and accessible. Many are building networks with fiber as well. In terms of access to licensed spectrum, there are examples in Thunder Bay, and unfortunately forgotten the name of the network there, where uh, arguably one of the first Indigenous communities to gain access to IMT spectrum. IMT meaning essentially mobile 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G spectrum.
Yes.
But it is pretty rare, unfortunately, because the frameworks for making spectrum accessible to on a smaller scale, on an affordable scale, simply haven't been there.
That's right. And I mean, in my experience, it's been kind of a hybrid approach to connectivity on reserve or in a sovereign community nation. That includes, fiber or cable. It's coming, and also low Earth orbit satellite connectivity provided by people or organizations we don't have to name, but it's hybrid setups, and so it's a combination of wireless, LEO, and fiber or coax. And I think each community is different. It depends on the type of resources your community has and where you are in terms of your economic development. As we know, connectivity is still somewhat of a I wouldn't call it a niche issue anymore. It's right at the forefront of what Indigenous communities need for everything. But each community is different, whether it's like water or housing or food. So where connectivity and the level of connectivity falls on that kind of chart or scale depends from community to community. So we really can't tell you what would necessarily work for you, but we do encounter that it's so far it's been a mix of fiber and then like fixed wireless or wireless access networks. Okay, I'm looking at the chat here. Yeah, KNet and Thunder Bay. We're at time.
Yeah.
Steve shared that usage stats are harder than it should be as part of the presentation. Maybe this is the reason why Indigenous usage stats are hard to determine. Yeah, it's another conversation. Okay, that's it. We have no further questions. We're at time. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and taking some time out of your day to hear Steve and I talk about Spectrum. And we're wishing you all very safe and happy holidays and all the best at the end of your work year, and that you remain safe and happy and healthy. And here's to 2026. We'll see you again. We hope to have many more of these webinars in the next year. So thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you again soon.